Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb here. Uh, in this particular session, I want to focus on topic 17, which is civil rights and social movements in the Americas. Uh, as in previous sessions, I will break up into three parts. Part one, overview of the civil rights movement. Part two, taking a look at the role of the federal government and the three branches in it. And then part three, focus on individualities and groups that make up the civil rights movement, as well as the social movements that will splinter off the civil rights movement. So, with part one again here, I want to focus on kind of an overview of the movement. Social scientists view the civil rights movement as really the second Reconstruction. There was advances against segregation through federal court decisions and more direct actions as black leaders forced the larger community to face segregation issues. Right. Um, for that to happen, though, there needs to be some factors leading to improvement for blacks, and we have to take a look at what was happening prior to World War II here, or the Second World War. The Great Migration was happening at the end of the first Reconstruction. The Great Migration, we sometimes say about 1870 to about 1930. And this is where an exodus out of the South is occurring of African Americans moving to northern cities or moving west for economic and social reasons. Increasing a sense of community in the 1920s, there is a revival, a cultural revival known as the Harlem Renaissance. We sometimes call that the era of the new Negro, and that is just a sense of new identity that is being found and created during this time period. And then, of course, the self-help ideology as well. This ideology has been around since neither political party, the Republicans or the Democrats, are interested anymore. The African American community is put on the fringe, and so realistically, if advancement is going to happen, it's going to have to come from them. So that's kind of part of the idea of the self-help ideology. Can find its roots in someone like a Booker T. Washington as well. The situation in 1930, though, if we look at it, three things stand out. Black consciousness, again, perhaps as a result of the 1920s and some of the new elements of identity being created here, a sense of black activism. You do have a number of groups out there that are working towards the advancement of blacks in the United States. They may not necessarily be all on the same page, but there is a sense of black activism, whether it's through union activity or through the NAACP or through the UNIA, which is called the United Negro Improvement Association. There are a number of groups out there engaging in black activism. They all realize in some regards the federal government was needed for real change because they understood states are slow in this process. All right, the NAACP was changing. It was going on a more activist mission, and to do that, they needed to form coalitions, and they're willing to work with just about any organization that wants to take on their issues as well. And so early on, sometimes the NAACP was viewed as a socialist group because socialist-leaning organizations were coming on board with their message. Litigation, though, was going to be the key to their success here, and they wanted to focus on civil rights violations. Really put on the spotlight here Amendments 14 and 15, as well as some of the civil rights acts that were passed during Reconstruction. They're being violated, and they want to take that on in the court system. The impact of the NAACP, though, is they're they're highly educated professionals, and they become the role models. They gain the respect of moderate whites because of their methods and their approach, and they raised awareness among Southern blacks that there is a possibility here that change can happen, and especially through the courts. And they took the causes to the courts, and they're going to have some small gains here as well. The impact of the Second World War, as we can look at it, this is the big catalyst here that really gets it going. Membership in the NAACP increases. Fighting for fascism over there in Europe exposed the racism at home. Blacks gained greater bargaining power. A. Philip Randolph had threatened to have a march on Washington during World War II if blacks weren't going to get equal pay, equal rights, or at least access to some of the federal war industry jobs. And an executive order is signed to extend that opportunity. So the March on Washington is put off for a couple decades. Tactics evolved into sit-in and boycott. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, is formed. It is a interracial organization. Blacks and whites get involved in it. And so some of those early tactics that we associate, or some of the tactics we associate with the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, are actually being put into practice here in the 1940s. Federal intervention is going to happen, and the way it's going to happen is the Justice Department is going to step in. There's going to be a civil rights division created here. The U.S. Supreme Court is going to come down with some cases that begins to strike at those Jim Crow laws and segregation. And President Harry Truman, forms the Civil Rights Committee, and they come up with a very important document known as To Secure These Rights in 1947, and lays out pretty much an outline or a blueprint of what needs to be done here to end the inequality in the United States. And so over the next several decades, those items that are listed in this document slowly are going to be checked off. Also, to go along with this, we see a growth of an urban, educated black middle class, more aware of the obstacles to their advancement than poor. And so they become a key ally in this movement. Television and other forms of media were another factor in the rising consciousness of racism among blacks. We can talk about it, we can say about it, but if we can actually see it, that has a lasting impact as well. So a variety of platforms are going to be used here to try to gain civil rights. Now, if we look at the civil rights movement and look at some gains that will happen here, we can break it into a couple parts here. So after World War II, the civil rights movement really kicks in. So this is that second Reconstruction. It really starts to kick in here. And we look at a number of events that contribute to it. And so sometimes historians like to use the death of Emmett Till as kind of the beginning of the civil rights movement. Others like to look at Brown versus Board of Education as the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the 50s. We'll start with Brown versus Board of Education. It's a legal victory in that it ends segregation in schools. So it takes down the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. And the goal is to end segregation in schools. And so in one hand, it gives African American students the opportunity to go to the public schools that white students had went to. The unfortunate side effect of it, though, is that the staff or the teachers that are instructing, though, have not become desegregated themselves. And so There is perhaps not a complete victory here when we look at the Brown versus Board of Education, but still very important. It takes down Plessy versus Ferguson. You have the Montgomery and mass protest, or the bus boycott of 1955. This was the famous one that Rosa Parks got arrested because she refused to give up her seat on the bus. A very young, charismatic minister, Martin Luther King Jr., is now going to be on the scene. He is put head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And it is through his methods, through his philosophy, that defines the early part of the civil rights movement, which is not going to create a very easy road to freedom, but it sets kind of sets the tone here. And when we talk about his methods, it's the nonviolent approach to it. It's the civil disobedience approach. It is the mass protest. Become the visual that will shake the conscience of America here. All right, very successful, succeeds here, and so that ends the desegregation on public transportation. Then the next phase here is 1947, the Little Rock 9 and Central High School here. You have the further desegregation of schools. Just because Brown versus Board of Education happened didn't mean it changed overnight. And so in 1957, 9 students, black students, attempted to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were blocked. The only way they were able to attend was President Eisenhower had to physically get the federal troops to intervene here and escort these 9 students to high school and serve as really escorts and protectors for them during that first particular year. Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, they fell short in promoting basic rights, reaffirming these Supreme Court decisions, but the federal government is going on the books here, trying to create some change here. Blacks will use several nonviolent strategies, as were used in some of the previous events, like boycott, sit-ins, and freedom rides, in order to advance civil rights here. A number of organizations were dedicated to these ideas, and so you have CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. James Farmer was a principal leader early on. Integration strand to the movement. Then you have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr. It ties the church to the movement. This organization, though, is of black ministers and priests, clergy, and this again highlights the importance of the church in the movement, as well as in the black community. And then a student branch of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, is going to be the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by early on as people like Diane Nash and John Lewis. It was a youth strand to the movement. We see some of these groups in action here at the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. It was SNCC. They attempt to desegregate the lunch counters. It's going to take time, but it just reinvigorated the movement, and it actively involved youth into it. Freedom Rides of 1961 are going to be led by CORE. Members of SNCC will also be part of it, but CORE is the big leader here. And what they wanted to do was to desegregate interstate busing. And so they were making an attempt to go from Washington, D.C. into the Deep South. Okay, so with the Freedom Rides, it provoked violence that led to a federal response. That was the big thing. The federal government now is going to get more active in responding to acts of civil rights violations. And actually, John F. Kennedy is going to put his brother Bobby Kennedy, who is the Attorney General, get the Justice Department more involved here. And finally, looking on this particular slide here, I have James Meredith, 1962, the University of Mississippi. He tends to approach civil rights from an individual perspective here. He is a member of the NAACP, was a veteran of the Korean conflict, and so he is going to, on his own, open up the University of Mississippi to integration. And very similar to like the Little Rock Nine, is going to need to get some federal protection, federal intervention in order to make that happen. So the doors of the University of Mississippi open up. Later, he's going to lead or he's going to initiate a march known as March Against Fear in the state of Mississippi as well. All right. Now, to kind of wrap up part one here, take a look at some of these other advances here. And between 1963 and 1965, the movement reaches its high tide here. This is at the big push happens here, and there's a lot going on in this small time period as well. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is really going to highlight the city of Birmingham as because it's viewed as the most segregated city in America. This is going to be on television. The moment that he shows up, he's almost immediately arrested, but the popular protest continues. There's a lot of criticism of Martin Luther King Jr. because there's quite a few youth involved in this. But realistically, this is televised, and the American public and the world actually sees the police violent reaction to the peaceful protests. And so public opinion is really swinging in the direction of civil rights here in 1963. Moving in a direction, I'm not going to say it's 100% behind, I'm going to say 50% behind the civil rights movement, but moving in that direction. It's changing consciousness here. In Birmingham, in the jail, he writes a letter called the Birmingham Letter, the Letter from Birmingham, where he is criticizing the white clergy who chastise him for what he is doing. He also criticizes the Kennedy administration, saying you need to do much more for African Americans in regards to civil rights. And so this is where he plans his march on Washington. And it's the biggest, the most aggressive campaign for Martin Luther King Jr., but it also brings together a collective action. The NAACP, CORE, SNCC is all involved here. This is popular protest at its finest, and the capstone to it is his I Have a Dream speech. As a result of it, there will be some civil rights measures passed in 1964 and 65. Two other big pushes will occur before those measures are passed. One of them is called Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. It's going to take on voting, as well as the March from Selma to Montgomery is also going to take on voting. The Mississippi Freedom Project, the idea was to extend voting to African Americans in the state of Mississippi, where has a high percentage of blacks in the state, but fewest percentage of blacks actually voting here. What stands out in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project was 3 civil rights workers are killed, and that overshadows it, and it sent a message real home to people that people will die for this particular cause. It revealed the depth of white supremacy that it does exist and continue to exist out there. And Fannie Lou Hamer, who was very politically active in the Democratic Party of Mississippi, realized the Democratic Party is blocking the measures of her and her organization, or at least her followers, and so they create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and try to be a counter to that Democratic Party and try to have a voice at the 1964 Democratic Convention, and still trying to find political solutions to these issues. To go with what is happening with the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, you also have Selma to Montgomery March, 1964. It's going to be realistically be 3 attempts to march to Montgomery. Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization shows up, and SNCC is already there in Selma, and there you can see that there is a divergence of thinking between different groups. Yeah, they want the same outcomes, but to achieve it, it's going to be different here. Martin Luther King Jr. initially defers to SNCC and the group that is there, and on that first march becomes known as Bloody Sunday. They get to Edmund Pettus Bridge. As they cross it, there is a violent reaction to it by the state troopers. It's caught on television. It's known as Bloody Sunday. And it really gets the president now on board here because, one, it looked bad domestically and internationally. 2, he's got to deal with the Vietnam issue, and still he's got this on his agenda, and so his hand is forced here as well. And the president is Lyndon Johnson now at the time, because Kennedy has been assassinated. So it accelerates the passage of federal legislation here. The second attempt stops before they even get on the bridge. The third attempt is successful, led by Martin Luther King Jr., popular support and protests involved here, and they do make it to Montgomery as well. So as a result of it, you do have some key federal legislation passed: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that guarantees access for all Americans in public accommodations, public education, employment, and voting. You have the 24th Amendment passed, which makes poll tax illegal in 1964. That was an old law that was passed during the era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow that was to prevent blacks from voting. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 empowered the federal government to intervene directly directing the enabled African Americans to register to vote. Huge. All right, so we see it by 1965. Some big gains have happened here. Involvement of a lot of different individuals, groups, and levels of government, but the civil rights movement does have some success by 1965. There's still a lot of things out there on the table that still need to be accomplished, but gains have happened. Slow, but they have happened here. All right, that'll be the end. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 will be starting here shortly.